Hey, I'm your host, Scott Dr. GX Goldfine, and this is Where'd You Get Your Funk From? For this episode, I'm delighted to welcome back classically trained funk keyboardist, singer, composer, producer, and author Danny Bedrosian. For the past 20 plus years, he has been best known as a central and touring member of Parliament-Funkadelic, also known as George Clinton and the P-Funk All-Stars. During that time, he's also appeared on numerous P-Funk and associated studio recordings and led many of his own projects, several of which feature fellow Funk Mob players. On his last visit with us in 2023, he talked about his first book, the authorized P-Funk song reference and official canon of Parliament-Funkadelic 1956 to 2023. There it is, which fully documents the vast recording history of one of music's most prolific and monumental acts. So I'm on that camera, Danny, just so you know why I'm putting it that way.
I got you.
Yeah. Um, this fall has seen the release of his second book, Make My Funk the P-Funk, which documents Parliament-Funkadelic's pivotal year of 1975 and the albums Chocolate City, Let's Take It to the Stage, and Mothership Connection. All right, man. Danny, so good to see you. How's everything?
Good to see you too, Scott. Thanks so much for having me back. I'm honored to be celebrating my third time on your show. So I'm very very honored to be back here with you.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of two-timers, but I think you're the first three-timer so far. So,
Nice. Yeah. That's awesome.
and I got to say, since that first book came out, it's been referenced on the shows many times. So thank you for that.
Oh, cool. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yep, for sure. And it was so good to catch you too, and Secret Army for the first time earlier this year in Charlotte. That was really fun.
Thank you. Yeah, that was a really good time. We're hoping we can get back to Charlotte sometime soon. It's been just such a fun time doing those Secret Army shows, and it'd been a while since we'd been to Charlotte, so we were really happy to get back there.
Yeah, well, we may be small, but we're mighty here. So,
That's right. That's right. No, I love Charlotte.
yeah, well, I hope you come back soon. And that was a lot of fun. So, you've been on the show twice before, as we said, but that was Truth and Rhythm. This is Where'd You Get Your Funk From? So, the tradition on this show is the first question being, Where'd you get your funk from? So, just in terms of kind of table setting of your background a little bit, how you first got exposed to the funk. Obviously, P Funk played a pivotal role, but how did you first get to the funk, and how is it sort of made up a large part of who Danny Bedrosian is?
Yeah. Well, it depends on what your definition of funk is, but I would definitely say that, my father introduced me to the music of Ray Charles at a very young age. As I've told you on Truth and Rhythm, I was classically trained, classical pianist, and my parents ran a piano school. In addition to, my father had a really, really insane classical music collection. But in addition to those records, he had one or two R&B and jazz records. And one of the ones that caught me was, well, a few of the ones that caught my eye were the Ray Charles ones. And then he had some James Brown. And I really liked the James Brown stuff. And so when I was about 8, my dad took me to the Lowell Auditorium in Lowell, Massachusetts to see James Brown live. And so that's probably, if people think of, that definition of funk, the James Brown sort of definition of funk, it would be James. Although, George said somewhere that the first person he considered to be funky was Ray Charles. So like I might be able to push it all the way back to Ray Charles. And then, P-Funk specifically, I got my funk originally from samples, because I'm a 90s kid. I'm a what they call an Xennial. I'm right in between Gen X and the millennials. I'm born in 81. And so that puts me right at the perfect age. I always say when you're 13, that's the age where you're the target demographic for popular music on the radio and stuff like that. So whatever you were listening to when you were 13 is kind of that thing. And so when I was 13, it was 90s hip hop. And it was, but by that point I had already been bitten by the funk bug and by the P funk bug specifically, because First time I probably noticed a P-Funk sample was maybe 91, 91, 92. And I was around 11, 10, 11 at that time. So that's around the time I got bit by the P-Funk bug, and I've been bugging ever since. So
You kind of came on it right when it was having a little bit of a resurgence, out of that like
indeed.
Prince support. And yeah, that was
Yeah,
kind of
PCU, Lollapalooza, the sampling era. You can point to a few different things, but yeah, that's definitely for sure.
and obviously it's infused a lot of who you are. I mean, you've embraced it so much, and your longest running keyboardist with the band, and you do the podcast with George now, and you're so ingrained in it. So how has it become, part of who you are and sort of your outlook on life, even?
Yeah, it's definitely changed, my trajectory. Well, I don't know, saying changed my trajectory probably isn't accurate because my trajectory essentially was to do just this. Um, every time somebody says, anytime anybody's ever said to me, "Oh, you're just hating." I'm like, "What do I have to hate about? I got in my favorite band. I'm in my favorite band. I don't have anything left to hate about." You know what I mean? I got no bitterness, no no rage, none of that angry. Well, I mean, all musicians, we can all get angry sometimes, but you know what I mean. Essentially, it's the kind of thing where um my position over the years definitely strengthened. It grew as it probably should, but a lot of it came down to, I think at a certain point you realize whether you're going to have staying power or not in any particular band. There's like that first couple years is a hurdle, and then the first 5 years is a hurdle, and the first decade is a hurdle. And if you get past that, you might have the staying power to be one of these, what they would consider, a longer tenured sideman for one of these famous bands that has these long histories. With P Funk, I was really blessed because my my parents, who were super supportive of my endeavors and my trying to get in the band, they probably thought, I don't know what he's thinking. These guys are all old enough to be, his parents, so like, themselves, so, I think that the average person or even musicians all over the world probably assumed that this band wouldn't be around still, like if you asked me in 1994, is P Funk going to be around in 2025? I'd be like, no, right? Everybody be dead. Am I going to be dead by then? Like, what, 2025 felt like 100 years from 1994. You know what I mean? So I think that the trajectory and the path has been both like what I was set out to do, but on the sort of dichotomous side of it, also something that I couldn't imagine happening for as long as it has, uh, because the longevity of Mr. Clinton and the longevity of Parliament-Funkadelic is something not to be trifled with. We were just talking about the resurgence in the 90s, but most people wouldn't have believed that it would have had a huge shelf life beyond the 90s. And to think that there's been three separate decades since the 90s of continuous P-Funk existence as a touring band, like that's crazy to me. So both what I wanted and some more than what I could have ever expected, for sure.
Well, to your credit, and thank you from all of us for keeping it alive. And so this book, again, congratulations on it. And
Thank you.
what inspired you to take this one on? And when did you start the process?
Well, we spoke about the first book a couple years ago, right after it was released, and that book, as we talked about, was a labor of love. It was a 30-year crusade, research project. This is, in some ways, it couldn't be more opposite. It took a year for me to write this book. I was approached by my editors at Roman and Littlefield um, about 2 months after the authorized P Funk song reference had come out. and they took me out to dinner. We were in LA. They took me out to eat. They said, Danny, the book is selling very well. It's become our bestseller of the year. And that's really saying something because the authorized P-Funk song reference came out on September 15th of 2023. There was a whole 9.5 months of no authorized P-Funk song reference sales. And for it to have, for it to have made top seller on this major publisher with just 2.5 months of sales, less than 2.5 months of sales, is really insane. I mean, to me, it was way beyond my expectations, but I had a funny feeling that it was going to do really well. And it way exceeded what they thought at Roman. And I could tell that it did because they were constantly having to redo print orders. Like there were several print runs of that first edition, several print runs. And that's not super common, with a major publisher that's already printing up pretty large numbers. They're printing up much larger numbers than we do in our little DIY world. So to see that, that it had maybe like 4 print runs or whatever it was in the first edition or more is really special, heartening, and wonderful for me. And they came to me and they took me out. They said, "Look, we want more books from you." And I was like, "Oh, okay, nice. All right, books. Okay." So they had actually initially brainstormed on what they thought would be a good book idea for me to do. And they approached me with a mothership book. They said, how would you feel about doing a book about the mothership, the P-Funk and the Mothership Connection, or the mothership itself? And, you know, they're very wise, to focus on iconography that is both recognizable and, for lack of a better word, iconic to the overall P-Funk thing. However, I'm a historian. I said this a few times before, but I'm a historian, and the mothership is such a piece of iconography that I felt it better left up to a philosopher or a spiritual guru.
Like holy, yeah.
Yeah, to write something about the
Hollowed, yeah.
yeah, to write something about the mothership. Ricky Vincent did a fantastic chapter in his funk book about the metaphysics of the P-Funk. And I was so happy that he was able to do that in addition to his P-Funk history chapter, because I remember as a kid thinking, wow, this metaphysical part, this is like a whole different, and you can go really deep into it. And a historian can also go deep into it, but I still felt it was something, the idea of the mothership is it's a transcendent idea, like Mickey Mouse or the Golden Arches, or or any kind of concept, the One Ring or something. You know what I mean? These iconographic sort of symbols. It's symbology, and it's directly linked to a spiritualism and a philosophical series of thoughts and ideas and sort of modes of thought and modes of life that, if any one person decided to write on it, they were going to get all kinds of blowback, because everybody has their experience, their first time they saw the mothership land in the 70s, or when it came back in the 90s, or when they even just first saw it on a TV screen, when they saw the idea of it happening, and with George coming out and all that kind of stuff. I
So it's
felt
kind of
it.
intimidating, yeah.
I mean, even more so than intimidating, I was like, I just finished writing this encyclopedic reference book. I'm I'm an insider, and it's my favorite band. I'm the archivist. I'm the musicologist. Um, I'm an historian. Writing something about the mothership in this kind of, I don't know, syncretic kind of way. I don't know. It just didn't seem like it didn't make sense for me for my second book. I'll put it like that. Maybe my 12th book would be fine. But for my second book, I was like, what I had in mind very much was the idea of doing what they call a monograph. And a monograph is just a fancy word for a bona fide history book. The type of history book that history students have to buy for their courses when they take history courses in college. It's the kind of history book that you would buy in the history section at Barnes and Noble. A book on the history of the Roman Empire or the history of Genghis Khan or whatever. That kind of thing. um, I'm really proud to say that this book, not jumping ahead too far, but this book represents the first ever monograph about P-Funk. My first book cannot be represented as a monograph. It is very much a reference book, which is its own category altogether. But I was trained to write history books, and I can get into this a little bit later. But essentially, this is what I went to school to do, was to write about history. So I kind of countered their offer immediately, and I said, well, how about a book about 1975? And they said, okay, well, what does that look like? Why 1975? I said, well, the mothership concept is born out of that year, but that's only the tail end of the story of 1975. There's two other fantastic albums that are released 8 months earlier in the month of April, and sort of the path that the band takes both between the beginning of the year and the month that they released those two albums, Chocolate City and Let's Take It to the Stage, and the period between those releases and Mothership, represents some major, major paradigm shifts in the band's overall makeup and its trajectory towards superstardom. I've said this many times, but it can't be underrepresented. That at the beginning of that year, they were still riding in station wagons, and there were about 10 or 11 of them. And then by the end of the year, they're going platinum and about to embark on what would be the biggest African American live stage show for the next 40 plus years. So it's a really major, major culmination and series of events that occur in 1975 that change this group from a Parla-Funkadelic thing into P-Funk, all in that year. The term is coined for the first time. The Bootsy persona is utilized for the first time. The status of the band as a platinum selling band, Parliament specifically, happens for the first time. Tear the Roof Off the Sucker, also known as Give Up the Funk, smashes all previous records on the charts, and is only beaten a few years later by Bootzilla and Flashlight, which make it to #1 only a couple years later. So you're seeing the beginning of the massive kind of uptick towards superstardom that is first sort of felt in 1975. So I approached, I said, what about that approach? And they were like, wow, Danny, that's awesome. That's an even better idea, because I said, I can't talk about the mothership without talking about my favorite album of all time, Let's Take It to the Stage, which to me, I mean, that's what's so like. P-Funk was already my favorite band before I'd heard that album, but when I heard that album, that was my favorite album of all time, a P-Funk or not. And so, like, to talk about something like Mothership and to completely gloss over Let's Take It to the Stage, which only happens 8 months earlier, let alone Chocolate City, which is such a major landmark album, it just seemed like doing a disservice to the overall historiography of P-Funk. And to me, my goal these days, ever since we put out the first book with Roman and Littlefield, and now it's Bloomsbury who bought Roman and is publishing this next one, it's been sort of my goal to create a canon all my own of historiographical research books on P-Funk history, so that 1,000 years from now, people will have the ability to look and say there was this thing called P-Funk that was a massive ensemble group that was just full of creative people and created a massive canon of music. I feel like the first book did that, and now we got to break it down into the important historical moments. So I'm happy to say, as I mentioned at the beginning of this answer to your question, they had approached me and said, we want more books from you. So this book, Make My Funk the P-Funk, really will represent the first in a series of, for lack of a better word, yearbooks, books that focus on one particular year in P-Funk history. And I've already picked out what my next one is going to be. I can't say it yet because it's actually 2 releases from now. I have another book that's been greenlit that I have a December 15th deadline on, and I was actually working on it all the way up until about 5 minutes before you and I did this interview. So forgive me for being late, but yeah, I've got a very hard deadline coming up on my third book, which, um, you know, is still in the subject matter, but it's a little different from these. But there will be more of these yearbooks as well.
Awesome. That's really exciting.
Thank you.
And you covered some of the other questions I was leading up to getting into the subject matter in the book, actually. But one other one I wanted to ask you before we dive in is what would you say was the biggest challenge in this undertaking for this particular one?
Well, there was definitely several challenges. I wanted to create a new set of primary source interviews separate from the massive amount that I had collected for the authorized P-Funk song reference. I'd say the biggest challenge was probably that, the collection of new primary source materials for this 2025 book that were mostly collected between 2024 and 25. Um, Reason being is because I wanted to get more subjects that I didn't even get in the first book. Even though I got a lot of people, I wanted to get even more people that I didn't get on the first one. So I'm happy to say I was able to get a few people that didn't make it on the first one, most notably Fred Wesley, who was a massive bastion of information, at least especially upon, with Mothership Connection and the months prior to like those first sessions for Mothership and like all the info. And he was going through a paradigm shift of his own. That's the 1 year that Fred Wesley is both in the JBs and Parliament-Funkadelic. So it's kind of cool getting his interviews were invaluable, completely just so powerful. The
It's fun
second
how he expresses himself too.
Oh yeah, he's awesome. Yeah, yeah. I love Fred. I've worked with Fred on and off many times throughout my tenure. I played with him in 420 Funk Mob, which is Clip Payne's group, all the way over in Heidelberg, Germany. I played with him at Berkeley with the Berkeley students and with Kenwood Denard, the drummer. And then I also worked with him, you know, obviously with Parliament-Funkadelic when he sat in various times and when Fred has opened for us and stuff. But most recently, we did a gig with this blues band, the Willie Amrod Band, and it just so happened to be just outside of Tallahassee, way out in the country. And I got hired for the gig, and Fred did too. And we got talking. I was able to give him a copy of the authorized P-Funk song reference. He was so happy to get one, and he was so impressed with the undertaking that I said, I got a new one. It would be awesome if I could talk to you. He said, yeah, sure. So it was really awesome to be able to talk to Fred about such a pivotal time in funk music history and American music history, and just such an important moment in history. And he really gave me some awesome stuff. And we even, without giving too much away, because I want people to get the book, that we kind of pulled the cover off of some historical. There's like any good history book. This one I think has also discovered some new information that was not hitherto known or understood or remembered correctly. So thanks to Fred, yeah, we got some really great stuff. But he's not the only one. Reggie McBride, who was the bass player for Rare Earth in the '70s, and they had the same management as Funkadelic. So those guys played on a few of the songs on Let's Take It to the Stage. And so Reggie was able to talk to me about those specific sessions and how those sessions went down, which was also invaluable information, because these are some very, I mean, there were 4 people in the room for some of these sessions, and most of those guys are if the people in the room are Eddie Hazel, Frosty, Bernie Worrell, George, and Reggie McBride, and the engineer. That means that half of the people in that room are deceased. So getting this information is so important. And then I conducted new interviews with a lot of the people that I'd already talked to who were important from that period. Gary Mudbone Cooper, Archie Ivy, who gave a lot of really great information. Also, so did Muddy, gave tons of great information, personnel information. Michael Kid Funkadelic Hampton, um, Rick Gardner, a lot of the guys that were there during that period, but also some kind of non P-Funk people that I thought would be important for understanding kind of the environment of this book. So I spoke to Dina Perlman, who a lot of people don't know who she is in the P-Funk world, but she's the daughter of the great Alan R. Perlman, who is the founder of the synthesizer company ARP. And 1975 is not just important because of P-Funk's massive strides in the albums they worked on. It's also important in that P-Funk first used two of Bernie's most used synthesizers in his career that year in 75. First in Chocolate City with the ARP String Ensemble, which found its way onto the title track and also onto the song Let Me Be. And then also on Let's Take It to the Stage, which was ironically kind of recorded actually before Chocolate City, with the introduction of the ARP Pro Soloist synthesizer, which ended up being Bernie's most used synth on the Parliament-Funkadelic records. Because I've actually done a list in all of my I could make a book of P-Funk lists too, would be another great like reference book idea. A lot of them are kind of crazy, but I did a list of like all of Bernie's keyboards that he used on the Parliament-Funkadelic records and which ones he uses the most. Now, the top three, of course, piano, clavinet, Hammond B3 organ. But then the fourth one and the first synthesizer with a bullet is the ARP Pro Soloist. And the fifth is the ARP String Ensemble. These instruments were vital to the P-Funk sound. Bernie didn't just use them and then stop using them after 1975. He continues using them through most of the hits and then keeps them in his rig as main. You know, the Art Pro Soloist stayed in Bernie's regular rig all the way until his passing. So the Art Pro Soloist was a part of his regular rig from the moment he picked it up till the end, which should show you the staying power and the importance and the dominance of that synthesizer. And Dina Perlman is a wealth of information when it comes to her father's work and his research and his building of these iconic synthesizers. And so she gave up some really cool information too that you don't always get in a music history book about some of the tech, you know, and some of the stuff that was being used for the first time on these albums. So it was very apropos, and I was really glad that I was able to get all these guys on this. But I think that probably was, you know, the main challenge was you know, finding the right primary sources to do such a specific approach of a book as this.
Hmm. And I had in my notes to mention about the ARP stuff because that was very interesting the way you went into some of that, and we got some of the technical explanations and details. That was very cool.
Thank you.
Um, Looking at 1975 itself, though, from a musical landscape perspective, it was such a woodshed, pivotal, whatever you want to call it, year for funk in general. I mean, really, the Ohio Players, Earth, Wind and Fire, Cool and I mean, they were all hitting their like zenith in a lot of cases, in terms of funk. And so, even against that backdrop, P Funk rose up to tower above them all. So it's even like that much more impressive in a way. But for me, what a great time to be alive, and all of this was just coming full force. And the groups were putting out one, sometimes two, of course, in P Funk's case, more than that, records in a single year. So things were moving so fast and the creativity was so high and the funk was so thick.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that. I think that like, you know, the triple threat Chocolate City Take It to the Stage Mothership thing kind of pushed them into a higher echelon, as you had alluded to just now, and I think that, with Chocolate City, they were kind of proving we can make you dance as much as anybody else. I know we know that we're known to be the kind of freaky ones, but we can do this same thing. And Chocolate City was like proving that sort of like dance floor dominance. Then Let's Take It to the Stage was like a decrying of the live prowess of Funkadelic. Like there had already been a 7-year run of Funkadelic being kind of that live band you don't really want to mess with, and people who make them open regret it later, you know. And then going all the way down to the title track, "Let's Take It to the Stage," being sort of the first diss record of all time, but George really doing it as a gimmick. You know, him coming from the Iggy Pop and the MC5 and those guys, they were all about shock. So he was combining shock with like wit and also with like soul and swagger and all that stuff. And you know, I would argue that the other funk bands had some swagger and some soul, but they weren't shock. They didn't have the shock value. And
Mm-mm.
so Funkadelic, that's why Funkadelic created the first diss record and not Kool and the Gang or Earth, Wind and Fire or Rufus. You know, George really goes in hard on those other bands, and you know, they all responded in their own way, but most of them responded in a way that George, what he wasn't trying to, he was trying to get them to make some kind of response back, and the only ones who probably did were maybe Kool and the Gang.
Yeah.
Um,
It ain't the boys. Yeah.
yeah, 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 exactly. And I think that that's what he wanted. I think he wanted more of that repartee, if you will, you know, the harmless, innocent sort of roasting.
It's like the
Uh,
Muhammad Ali kind of thing, you know?
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. But you know, combining the, you know, because it reminds me of when George and Iggy Pop tried to do the gimmick of getting married, and George wore the wedding dress and stuff. Like there was that whole concept, and it goes back to those like hard rock, you know, when they were doing the crazy stuff, and George was, you know, attempting to do crazy concepts, but in his new kind of more R&B centric world, you know, albeit he's rapping at a time that is predating Rapper's Delight
Oh, yeah.
by years and years, you know, and even rapping in meter, you know, there are ones where it's more spoken, like Last Poets, you know, like his "Mommy, What's a Funkadelic," or Maggot Brain, or Good Thoughts, Bad Thoughts, or those type of things. But then there are ones that are, you know, wrapped in meter, like Whole Lot of BS, Loose Booty, Let's Take It to the Stage, you know, and these things are all predate Rapper's Delight by years.
Hmm.
They all predate all of that stuff. So um, it was his combining of several different like cultural renditions, as he would put, like renditions of different worlds that he kind of combines together into like these renditions of ideas, you know, and then by the time Mothership comes, they've done all these things, and it's culminated to a point where they've got this super slick record that sounds like nothing nobody's ever heard before.
For
So
sure.
that is, I think, a big reason why 1975 pushes Parliament-Funkadelic into a higher realm. You know, before that, a lot of times they were opening for those, like opening for the OJs, opening for the Ohio Players, Graham Central Station, or whomever. But you know, then after that, it's a little bit more headlining. And George and Archie talk about that a bit too, how this is sort of, they look at this year, the big paradigm shift for them in this year that they talk about over and over again is the kind of switching from being an opener to a headliner.
I got to say also, Danny, before you even get into 1975, when you do the area of the book, you talk about history, you cover the entire preceding 20 years in 10 pages,
Yeah.
and you do a great job of it. That like
Thank
sets it
you.
up so well. And I just looked at that summary. I was like, wow, this is awesome, covering that 20 years in 10 pages. So
Thank you. I'm
yeah,
going to
really
try to
cool for
make
that.
that like a template for these yearbooks, is having like a last episode, you know. And I know it's funny too, because from a P-Funk historical standpoint, it's like a blink of an eye. Because it's almost only it's between a quarter and a third, or between a 20% and 25% or whatever of P-Funk history is those little 20 years. But a ton happens in that period, obviously, and it's uh, uh, from any other band's standpoint, though, on the obverse side of things, it would be longer than most bands' whole existences, you know, that just that 20 years. And that 20 years in a lot of ways represents their underground kind of push forward and up and out and through different genres too, like almost like multi-dimensional travel, the doo-wop thing and the Northern Soul and then psychedelia and then more what I considered what I started talking about is like more album oriented rock, which they kind of mastered in those years after Maggot Brain, from like 72 to 74. And then, and yeah, I felt like it was important because we just land right in 1975, no pun intended, and we just kind of start right there. Uh, you're missing so much important exposition. You never know about certain members that you should probably know about before you get to 75, even though they're not
Mhm.
there anymore. It is an important reason to sort of understand those who came before and those records that came before. Um, I think, when I do the other yearbooks, I'm probably going to do a similar type chapter in all of them, just for the uninitiated. There was this, this deals with comic books, but I think it really works well with music too. This one of the Marvel editors, Jim Shooter, used to say every comic is somebody's first comic, and
Mhm.
you have to import some of that exposition so people understand what is happening before. And it's okay to have them be a little confused, but they need to have some kind of understanding
Yep.
and
Context.
yeah, context. So uh, uh, I feel the same way with this P-Funk history. It's so epic. There's so much going on. Getting a little bit of background of what happened right before is super important. It's the same reason why I wanted to do the whole book about 75 instead of just Mothership, is that there has to be enough context, like historical contextualization, for there to be like an understanding of what happens next.
Hmm. Well, at the same time, I mean, you could have easily rambled on about it, but you just had it so concise. So I appreciate that.
Oh, thank you.
Um,
And it
you know,
wasn't even edited. It was pretty much kept all as is, I'm happy to say. So,
and for me as a kid, basically, it's really extra interesting because 75 is the year I came to P Funk,
wow.
and Mothership Connection was the second album I ever bought on my own. Skin Typing, the first one, I Hope Players,
Cool.
and when I first heard that, it was kind of weird to me. It took a while to start to digest it and have it make sense because it was so ahead of its time and so different. But when it did, man, when it clicked, it was, for life. It was just life changing. And I also went a little bit backwards because Mothership Connection was the introduction. So then, I ended up going backwards and getting, Chocolate City and Let's Take It to the Stage after that because it took a long time for me to be able to find a copy of Let's Take It to the Stage.
Yeah.
So even in the mid to late 70s, it was hard in Los Angeles to find a damn copy of Let's Take It to the Stage, or several of those Funkadelic albums were hard to find then.
Yeah.
But when I heard those, it started to go to a different level with Funkadelic, where that had to take a while also to gestate and be able to make sense. And then when it did, wow, you know. But so that's just my experience. I wanted to share that with you. But
That's
let's talk
awesome.
about this specifically. So groundbreaking stuff, like you had said, especially the title cut. So the cultural significance, the musicality, the Black Power stuff, it just had so much of an impact and was so groundbreaking. And yet it still made it onto radio in a lot of cases, which is pretty amazing. But just Bernie, I wanted to share a quote here from your book on Bernie's playing. You say his contrapuntal, if I'm saying that right, because that's the first time I've encountered that word listed in your book.
I think it's contrapuntal, I think. I think.
Contrapuntal, okay, which is like different kinds of melodies, right?
Hmm.
Uh, so you say his contrapuntal work, piano work on the title track is second to none, and it paved the way for future keyboard work by both himself and all keyboardists in the funk and R&B worlds. So right there, I mean, that's sort of like a declaration by Bernie Worrell, besides the
Yeah.
band itself. But
Yeah.
just, I mean, I'm sure he's your hero. Can you just speak to that for just a moment?
Yeah, yeah. So it's a good you picked a good one. Yeah, he did some stuff on that song. Aside from even talking about the ARP string ensemble, which we talked about a little bit already, and how that was the first cut that they used that on. That stuff is super important. But if we just focus on his piano playing, for instance, when it goes to that chorus part, the Gain and Anya part, when it goes to what he's doing on the piano, that stuff, Bernie Worrell is really good at taking one acoustic instrument like piano, for instance, and bridging the gap between everything you'd ever heard on a piano in rhythm and blues before and everything you've never thought you could hear on a piano. And I use that term contrapuntal because he's doing things that feel like if you don't listen to him and you just let it go, he's always hitting those places where the space is. You know, Bernie always found where that space was and filled it so right. You know, it would always be the spot where all the other musicians didn't want to put anything, so they didn't know what to put there. He always knew what to put in those spots. And he just does some stuff on that song that is, like I said, it like some of it has roots in, you know, the great piano playing of like your like Duke Ellingtons and things like that. Even some like almost some Oscar Peterson-esque type stuff, like older stuff, you know. And even Art Tatum, because it marries that classical. But then he just does some other, his rhythmic approach is so advanced on keyboards, and it's still advanced on keyboards, you know, whereas almost every other innovative stride in any instrument that goes back for 50 years has been advanced and sort of surpassed. So, for instance, I don't know, let's talk about, okay, synth bass playing. Let's just use this as an example so I can prove my point. Synth bass playing had its beginning in the 1970s. There would be these somewhat simple lines, but they were effective. They had enough polyrhythmic accuracy that people could move to them, and they really pushed on the radio. Today, synthesizer players are doing things with the synth bass that never was thought of 50 years or 45, 48 years ago, because now they're not just new technology, but people are going further and further in the technicality of what can be achieved, and the technology is keeping up with their ability to push that. So that's like that. When it comes to Bernie's chordal work, be it on piano or clavinet, we'll just use those two instruments for a good example since they tie in directly to Chocolate City. His piano and clavinet work on a rhythmic level is advanced to the point where you don't hear the new generation surpassing what he was doing rhythmically. You may hear them trying to and surpassing some melodic ideas, even some like runs, and, you know, because everything is getting faster and everybody's going, you know, it's, you know, that's just how it goes. You know, you've got 10-year-old kids playing like Chick Corea now, you know, so like, you know, there's that sort of generational, but his piano, the rhythmic counter rhythms and that stuff is not really like a guy that's taking what he does and pushing it way beyond. Like, he's still pretty much the top of that, and nobody really denies that. And, you know, for me to be a working keyboard player and say it, you know that it's pretty much true, because every keyboard player wants to say that they're able to take something and go to the next level with it, you know, or whatever. And some people may say it of me, but like, I would say that it's the Bible, but it hasn't been improved upon either. And it marries the old and the new, or I should say the familiar and the unknown is probably a better way to put it. Bernie was able to take things that everybody knew from the blues and from R&B, Ray Charles, that stuff, and even old jazz, Louis Jordan, and that kind of sound, and marry it with the unfamiliar, with the unknown, with the strange, with the future, with space, with and do it on an acoustic instrument like a piano. I'm not even talking about his far afield synthesizer work. I'm talking about a riff on a piano that he would do, you know. Chocolate City, the title track is a good example of it. There's several good examples of it on the song Doing What Comes Funky on that same album. He does that sort of contrapuntal piano work, these like counter rhythms that just, a keyboard player can go and try to learn it. And when they go and listen to it, they're like, wow, he is hitting all the notes that I never even think of, or hitting all the rhythm. Like he's placing it in the places that most people aren't thinking, even keyboard players. They're just not thinking that way. And he thought that way all the time. It's one of the things that made him special.
Also the way he mixed some of the different keyboards, deciding which one went where. And, like you're saying, others may try. There, plenty of avant-garde players, but that doesn't still encapsulate what he brought to it. So,
Yeah. And much like Fred said, too, a lot of that, too, is kind of a combination with George, because George would be, and as being a keyboard player who's worked in the studio with George a million times, he's kind of picking the sounds, too. And then a lot of times, Bernie will give George more than he ends up using. And then it's that choosing. He does the same thing with me, and he did the same thing with Amp Fiddler. Then George has to kind of choose which ones is he going to keep, what's he not going to keep. And that's a big production decision that makes a huge difference in how we hear these songs. Fred Wesley said the exact same thing, that he gave George like way more than what was on there. And George's genius was in finding how to fit all that stuff together. Because Fred said himself, he didn't do it all in the row that you hear it, in the sort of context that you hear it, or in the sort of order that you hear it. He did it about some other way, and George along with the engineer, put it together that way. So with Bernie's stuff, some of it is like that too. But yeah, the sound choices and the instrument choices, a lot of times that was also like what they were getting, the new gear that they were getting at a time.
new toy. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be several people that are involved in like why something arrives at the studio. And that's an influence. That makes an influential event. So sometimes it's several people, but of course, no, you can't put past the fact that what he played is what he played. And that stuff just, I could write several books just about that.
Yeah, and the book does do a great job pointing out just George's amazing sensibilities for, putting the sounds in the different places. And of course, his just conceptual stuff is amazing. His wordplay is amazing. And in Chocolate City is just so much, on center stage for him too, with just the verbal stuff and the character building, how it
Yeah.
starts to really come up in the organization, through
Yeah.
that. And elsewhere on the album too, it's just a great reminder of what a unique and cool singer George was too back then. His
Yeah.
voice was totally unique.
I think that's missed on a lot of people. From the moment I first started listening to this music, I was very interested in finding out who sang on what. But as time went on, it wasn't hard to figure it out, really, because these voices were so, at least when it came to lead vocals, they were so trademarked. Like there wasn't a lot of somebody trying to sing like somebody else. Everybody had their voice, and George was no exception. I think about very specific tracks and cuts where his voice, it just cuts through, and despite the fact that like a lot of the both lay people who don't know much about P-Funk and also the sort of music snobs, whether they come from the classical world or the jazz world, or even the R&B world, will kind of like downplay George's vocal ability as like a non-singer. And even George will like approach that kind of rhetoric sometimes.
Well,
Um,
back then, at least
but
he was a vocalist, a stylist for sure, I think.
Yeah, yeah. But while they definitely would downplay it in that way, like I said, both critics and the man himself, I would argue that it is a singular vision that created a voice that doesn't sound like anybody else. That you really don't need to you don't need to go much further than the Parliament's records to see like how much actual technique he actually had, because people really downplay it. And of all people, Bernie Worrell, who's arguably one of the most musical, if not the most musical member of this band in its history, was the first one to point out that George had a ridiculously good voice in the early period, and not just on a, a fancy schmancy level, but like on the level of like his range, his tone. Bernie really talked about that stuff. And again, like I said, George downplays it because he knows himself. He doesn't have any training and da 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 da. But some people are just special. They just have something innate. And you can point to different records, the Osmium record, things like "Put Love in Your Life" or "Soulmate" from Hardcore Jollies, or really any number of records where his voice is featured as like a main. "Sendagram" by Jessica Cleaves. Like his voice, he was really special, and still is. And a lot of people just they miss that for some reason. I think in a lot of ways they miss it in the same way I talk about how when people come to the live show, they see the party and they don't see how much work is going into that. They just see the front. The front of the stage is the singers and stuff. And it's like, yay. And then like behind all that,
All the chefs in the kitchen, yeah.
behind all that is a whole bunch of work, is just like boom, boom, the blacksmiths and the farmers and the plows and and it's all very industrial and and the concentration is key and the focus is key, and you got to pay attention to everything, and we've talked about all the minutia of that before, but it's much like that is a largely misunderstood aura in the P-Funk legend. So is the misunderstanding of sort of George's vocal approach. There are some songs like "Common Law Wife," "Side Effects," both from the Chocolate City thing, that really show off a singer that was more of a singer than people choose to label him as. I think it's
Absolutely.
important. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Props to that. But I think within the, as you're talking, I'm thinking within the entire funk mob, there is so much talent that some of the abilities of some of the players are sort of not known or not considered enough. But, in this book in particular, you talk about, Mudbone was so key on drums and so many tracks.
Yeah.
And Eddie Hazel could sing really well too.
Oh yeah.
And, just all these and Bootsy on drums and guitar as
Right.
well as bass. I mean, there's
Mm-hmm.
so much talent.
Yeah, there really is. And it goes back to my first book in a lot of ways. A lot of roads lead back to there because it's that kind of thing where, oh, I didn't realize Bootsy played guitar and drums on this track too. Yeah, he did. There were a lot of tracks where Bootsy would bring to the table that would be drums, bass, guitar, Bootsy. And sometimes they'd be drums, bass, guitar, Bootsy with Catfish and Gary also on guitar. Like that was a common combo that they would utilize. And sometimes it would be just the man in the box, and then they'd overdub it and they put Bernie and and the live drums and horns, vocals, etc. So like that was a formula that they worked with a lot of times, things like Chocolate City, or what's another good example? Like the song is familiar, things where Bootsy was kind of doing drums too. Obviously later stuff, Flashlight, One Nation, etc. But yeah, there was a lot of examples of that where Bootsy was taking on several roles, and these sessions are part and parcel with the beginning of Stretching Out in a Rubber Band. That literally comes right behind, right after Mothership Connection, and I took a really cool picture of some of the tapes, the master tapes. It's in the book, and you can see like the exact like month and date that they recorded some of those things. And so like Mothership, a lot of it was cut in 74, but some of it was cut in 75 too. And Stretching Out was mostly cut in 75. Was pretty much all cut in 75. And so you kind of get an idea of when these things, Let's Take It to the Stage, like I said before, is actually the oldest of the three, even though it came out second of the 375 records, and even has several songs that were culled off of not the last Funkadelic album, but the 2 albums before, Cosmic Slop. Baby I Owe You Something Good and No Head were both from either Cosmic Slop or in between Slop and Standing on the Verge, and just didn't have a place to go. And on Chocolate City, which was cut mostly between the end of 73 and the beginning of 75, also has cuts from as early as 71, 72, well, 72, which were taken from the cutting room floor of America Eats Its Young. Common Law Wife, which was kind of tacked on to the remastered edition, and I Misjudged You, which was a regular album cut on Chocolate City, were both outtakes from the America Eats Its Young sessions. So, yeah, stuff finds its way later on, you know.
The cream eventually rises to the top, and
Yeah.
just one more thing. Well, two more things about Chocolate City, though, because it
Mm-hmm.
was so innovative. But just it set the, as you mentioned, I think in the book, the template for P Funk, and some the song P Funk for one thing
Mm.
comes right, from the Chocolate City type of vibe.
Yeah.
But Bootsy's playing specifically on it,
Mm.
incredible, and just so innovative, and in sound and style, impact. Between that and also the use of the drum machine, just very interesting on that track.
Yeah, I think George had already started a new formula with his Casablanca Parliament albums, where the side A would be more Bootsy dominated, and the side B would be more a lot of the guys that you were already familiar with from Funkadelic. So, Chocolate City is an even more succinct version of the formula he started on Up for the Downstroke the year before, where Up for the Downstroke has more Bootsy stuff dominating the first side, and then the second side has a lot of the ballads and more boogie. Um, Chocolate City is even more in that realm because side A, Bootsy is the only bass player. He plays the bass on all the songs on side A. Chocolate City, Ride On, Together, Side Effects, and What Comes Funky. They're all Bootsy. Then side B really kind of shows off that funkadelic side right away with Let Me Be, which is like so cool, the classical thing. And then, If It Don't Fit, Don't Force It, which is definitely, Gary and Eddie and Boogie and those Tyrone Lampkin, is that crew of guys. And then I Misjudged You, like I said, which is kind of a throwback with the Parliaments singing from an America Eats Young session. And then Bigfoot, and with more Boogie and Tyrone, Glenn Goyne's
Glenn
introduction.
Goins.
Yeah, his introduction to the band, and with that monstrous vocal performance. In a lot of ways, his most bombastic vocal performance really is that first one. And you see George doing this over and over again. He does it on Clones of Dr. Funkenstein, where Bootsy dominates side A and Boogie dominates side B. And so this sort of becomes a thing that he does kind of semi regularly with Bootsy and Boogie, and just kind of with the styles a little bit. So Chocolate City it's a great example of it, maybe the most succinct example of it.
Yeah, those three tracks in a row, also Ride On, Together, and Side Effects, just killer.
Yeah.
Man. And Ride On kind of portended the mothership, riding on the mothership later on. But
Oh yeah, sure.
yeah. So moving on to this masterpiece, I'm right with you, Danny. This is also my
Yeah.
favorite Funkadelic record.
Nice.
So, and Mothership is my favorite record of all time. So,
Oh wow, cool.
yeah. And there's not a lot of records on my wall. You can probably see some of them,
Yeah.
but this one, Mothership Connection, or both, you can't see them. They're over here on the wall,
Nice.
signed copies and stuff. And then
Cool.
behind me, those gold records are Mothership Connection and Tear the Roof Off is the single.
Oh,
So
cool. That's
that's
awesome.
the importance in my musical makeup and life. So
I love that.
when I first heard this record, after when I could finally get it, like I told you, good to your ear hole, when it started off, I could not believe how badass that track was.
No.
And it's like, why wasn't this played on radio? Why wasn't this a hit? This is an unbelievable, perfect synthesis of the funk and the rock.
Yeah. What's funny? My answer to this is seems a little far afield, but it'll make sense at the end. I just watched the Luther Vandross documentary. Did you see that?
No.
It's really good. And in it, there's a whole section where they talk about Luther's struggles to crossover, and how, both he and the label kind of felt that they were doing everything that they should, and it just wasn't working. And there was a newspaper article that was being used in the documentary where they're like, zooming down through the article, and it's an article about Luther can't seem to cross over. Like, he just, whatever he does, he still can't seem to cross over. And you can't see the whole article, but in big bold letters right on the side, it says Funkadelic. And so somewhere in that article, they're talking about Funkadelics, saying, probably using them as a parallel from a decade or two before, saying that, Funkadelic also dealt with this too black for the whites, too white for the blacks, whatever that is. And I think Good to Your Ear Hole is probably a very good example of that dichotomy and of that rock in a hard place situation that was laid on them and maybe made as an excuse far too often, and maybe given a little too much credit. But it's no secret that the radio industry was, and still is, for lack of a better word, pretty segregated, especially back then. It's not to say that there weren't black acts being played on white radio and that there weren't white acts being played on black radio, but it was all controlled in a very sterile, kind of by the book way that seemed very diplomatic in a very unfair way, like, not like, like diplomacy behind a curtain, essentially, where somebody's making this decision for everybody. And I think, Parliament and Funkadelic had not yet become a household name. So Good to Your Ear Hole, again, this is right before the big splash that is the explosion of the P-Funk right after this. And so this, in a lot of ways, it's even one of the lower charting Funkadelic albums, which is funny. I mean, well, the album does pretty well, but I just mean lower charting in terms of its singles. The album did pretty well up against other Funkadelic albums on the charts in terms of albums. But the only two singles from that record were Better by the Pound and the title track, and they really didn't make it that far. And even Standing on the Verge before it did better than Let's Take It to the Stage as far as singles go. So, it was sort of more of the same. I use this example a lot of times with people, and I've said it a lot of times, but it's every time I say it, it still excites me as a concept. One Nation Under a Groove, 3 years after the stuff we're talking about, is the biggest P-Funk hit of all time. It lands on the charts for 8 or 9 weeks and is their biggest hit, and it's the biggest hit on the R&B charts in 79 at all. And comes out in 78 on the album, and so on and so forth. And it represents the high watermark of P-Funk. Now, it was a hit for Funkadelic, and ironically was kind of the biggest hit in P-Funk history, when that, like, traditionally speaking, Funkadelic was not the hit makers. They only had 2 songs that really did anything big chart-wise. And they were both after 78, So you have to draw, if you were going to draw a line back to the highest charting song before One Nation on Funkadelic, what do you think it would be? I'm going to ask you, Scott. What do you think without looking it up, what's the highest charting Funkadelic song before One Nation Under a Groove?
I want to know if it's Good to You.
It's a good guess. And it's actually even further back than that. It's I Bet You.
Okay.
So their very first record got them a top 20 or 25 hit that they were never able to replicate or do better than for the next 9 or so years. It's very telling about the struggles that Funkadelic had. Parliament didn't struggle nearly as much. People like to use Downstroke and Chocolate City as these, like, pre-success albums, and I make that argument as well in my book. But that's kind of throwing shade on something that is missed. As soon as they go to Casablanca and reignite Parliament, Up for the Downstroke is a number 10 hit right away. And if you compare that to even Funkadelic's biggest hit, which, as I just said, it was I Bet You at the time, you're still 12 or 13 spots higher right away with a bullet. Parliament's first, if you discount Osmium, which was obviously a Parliament album, but from many years before in a very different style. If you consider Up to the Downstroke the first of the sort of seminal, Casablanca-based, at least, Parliament albums, they're immediately going in with charting success. Immediately. Because they're like, okay, we'll play this horns, black music thing, you know what I mean? And it immediately sells.
Yeah,
It
it was accessible
immediately,
enough. Yeah.
yes, it immediately goes into they still have their raw and rugged stylistic leanings. And those are very much heard even in the production style of the first two Casablanca records, Downstroke and Chocolate City. But they're immediately charting. And Funkadelic, you're seeing that's not the same case, despite the fact that Let's Take It to the Stage is one of the most brilliant albums ever conceived. It just didn't do anything on the charts. So I don't want to spend too long on that concept because the album is too good to not focus on the high points. But that is an interesting tidbit of information regarding an album that is so highly regarded by not just the fan base, but just, music listeners in general.
Yeah. And I think, maybe just the title "Get Your Ear Hole" turned off some, if any rock radio was thinking about it, they'd look at the title and say, oh, it just, nah.
Yeah,
But,
yeah, true.
But I got to run through that track list. So after "Get Your Ear Hole," "Better by the Pound," which you mentioned, "Be My Beach" with Bootsy doing his first Bootsy persona, "No Head
Yeah.
Backstage Pass," "Let's Take It to the Stage," which you talked about already.
Yep.
"Get Off Your Ass and Jam," which just I first heard that at a house party in high school, and I was just like, "What is that?" And the DJ was playing it back to back many times over, and that was before I got my hands on this album, and it was incredible. "Baby, I'll Use Something Good," "Stuffs and Things." The song is familiar, and "Atmosphere." I just blown away by this album. The only little bit of nitpicking I had with it was some of the songs I love are short.
Oh yeah, I think that's what's good about it though, because it shows you that P-Funk, as it will soon be called, was already trying to find ways to be more palatable. I really do believe that's what that was. Atmosphere is crazy, but Gary Scheider once said, George always had a way of putting one kind of crazy cut, on every album. It'd be Wars of Armageddon, or Atmosphere, Good Thoughts, Bad Thoughts, and Eulogy in Light or something. I think Atmosphere represents that for that record. But in a time when they're starting to clean their sound up, for lack of a better word, they're starting to kind of eschew a more maybe I don't know, popular isn't maybe the right word, but something that's a little cleaner, a little less psychedelic.
Sonically,
yeah, sonically less psychedelic.
yeah,
Even
yeah.
Good to Your Ear Hole that has the the guitar and stuff. It's still a cleaner, recorded sonically. I think by the time they get to Cosmic Slop, Funkadelic sound is a little more. It's a little cleaner. There's not quite as many as Gary also said airplanes. There's not as many airplanes flying overhead, and that's either a good thing or a bad thing depending on who you talk.
It felt like it almost coincided with Pedro's artwork.
Yeah, and that's some real singular artwork he did on Let's Take It to the Stage. That's
Yeah.
he almost comes to with a different style than he did on any of the other records, and just some really it still has some of the scatological craziness and the almost like Dali in space, but it's different. The front cover is very different from anything else he
It's
did.
more focused. It's less all over the place than the other
Yeah,
ones.
yeah. So that's a really cool kind of sets it apart from the other Westbound records.
Yeah. But the one song that's short that really just I want more was "Stuffs and Things." I mean,
Nice.
that one is really going when it fades
Yeah,
out. It's like,
that's
where
true.
is that longer version from the studio? I gotta hear it once in my
Yeah,
life.
yeah. There is one too. But yeah, that is one of those ones that they did with Barry Frosty Smith and Reggie McBride, from Rare Earth on guitar, I mean, on drums and bass, and then Bernie on that ARP Pro soloist and Eddie Hazel, and it's just I have a couple ARP Pro soloists, and we've been doing these shows in promotion of the book. And we're doing a lot of the songs that feature the ARP Pro soloist because since we have one, we might as well, this is like really curating historical. It's like seeing a Baroque group that uses like a period organ, to create their music from the 16th or 17th century. It's the same kind of thing. We have the real instrument. So when we did Stuffs and Things, it was like, wow, this is just like the record, because we'd always done it with the rhythm, the rhythm part, and with the vocals. But unless you have those instruments, it just doesn't sound the same on another synthesizers. So we never really did it with like the full synthesizer part until we started doing these promotional things. Let's Take to the Stage. The title track is officially the first debut of the pro soloist in P-Funk. So we also did that, and Super Groovalistic, which is on the next record, which has a lot of pro soloist on it. But yeah, those records, I kind of like the short punchy nature of those Take It to the Stage records, because it sort of shows them trying in a way to move away from the 13-minute marathon song that nobody's going to play on the radio. And you don't want your favorite band that you love to like conform. To me, it wasn't conforming. It was really like a strong middle ground, like really finding a strong middle place where they could capture more of an audience in general. And I think they had several ways they were trying to do that on that record. And I think from a listener's perspective and from a fandom perspective, they definitely did that.
They even moved away from that, with Tales and Hardcore and,
Yeah.
mostly longer songs. But we talked about Chocolate City being sort of a template. I think Let's Take It to the Stage was also a sort of template for them, that really set the tone for like those kind of, slower groove, heavy rhythm guitar, rapping kind of jams that came afterwards.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And there are things on that record that are so iconic to Let's Take It to the Stage, like Baby I Owe You Something Good, and that like tum 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 bam tum 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 bam, and
Really
just like
dramatic.
it's
Yeah.
so dramatic, and it's so thematic and theatrical too. And George really plays with that, and I talk about that a lot in the book, how he was friends with all the guys in Hair, and how he was really, he and also Vivian Lewis, one of his songwriting partners, who's the mother of Tracy Lewis. Um, they stuff like Let Me Be from the record before this, they were writing a lot of really theatrical stuff. And Baby I Owe You Something Good is another example of that, like just so theatrical. And then when it stops and it goes to Bernie on the clavinet doing that really beautiful kind of Baroque sounding little clavinet thing. Um, yeah, it's just the moments. Like that's what sold me on Let's Take It to the Stage more than any other record. There are these beautiful, quiet moments that you just don't really have in a big way on any other Funkadelic records. And I love all the Funkadelic records, don't get me wrong. But those quiet, like the song is familiar, is probably my favorite track on the whole album. And does that make it my favorite song of all time? It's hard to say. It's my favorite song on my favorite album, but it maybe still isn't my favorite song, but it's amazing. And like the quiet kind of the shifting in, between the chorus and the verse, it's just so beautifully done, and it harkens back to some of the same kind of genius moves that the Beatles were making. And a lot of times I compare this album to Rubber Soul, because it's very similar to that album in what it represented for the Beatles. This is what Let's Take It to the Stage represented for Funkadelic. Like Rubber Soul to me is actually the Beatles' creative peak, in my opinion. And it happened right before Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And so, you've got Let's Take It to the Stage happening right before Mothership. And to me, it's also kind of the creative peak. And of course, that's very much my opinion. But
Yeah.
an argument can be made, though, that it is very similar. I also talk about In a Silent Way by Miles as being that record for him right before Bitches Brew. You can do this with a number of different artists. Look at the one like right before their kind of ground shattering breakout, different happening of an album that came.
It's like the peak of the buildup right before the climax.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
I have a quote from you that I was going to say regarding Baby I Owe You Something Good from the book. So
Mm.
you say, quote, Every section shows off a different moment, with parts appearing both exceedingly strong and overwhelmingly fragile at the same time.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, that's a pretty good way of putting it. Like there's real moment, Calvin Simon's, you know, sort of pleading parts and the quiet parts, and then Gary's like falsetto and his like soaring notes in the louder parts, and how they mirror up against what the guitars are doing, like Gary's solo in the solo section, and Ron Bykowski doing those little kind of harmonic notes up under him. I mean, it's so much beauty, and it's really being sold to us through a band that we're being sold to believe is dogmatic and ugly and loud and or whatever. But like they're really showing off some serious sides to them, with this record. I just love it.
Yeah, just to me, on this one, the composing, the production, the recording, the keys, the guitars, the vocals with the operatic, elements too, it
Yeah,
just all coalesced, right?
right.
You know?
And everybody always has to, you can't talk about it without talking about, the introduction of the Bootsy persona on Be My Beach, and how that, really gave way to things like I'd Rather Be With You, and all the like the Bootsy ballads, or what they sometimes call the silly serious ballads, how that really had its start with Be My Beach on Let's Take It to the Stage. I think without Be My Beach, you might not have platinum rubber band albums. Be My Beach is really sort of setting a tone, that helped prepare Bootsy and George for what they would create right after that.
And ironically, vast majority of Bootsy fans if they discovered it at all, was later,
Yeah, yeah, it's true. It's very true.
Yeah. Um, all right. Well, on to the monster.
Mm.
So the motherlode, the mothership. Man, when I first heard, I was talking about it earlier, but when I first heard that P-Funk track, it took a little while to click, but when it clicked, it's just like Chocolate City. It's just unbelievable. And the rap, the Bernie again,
Mm.
but also the horns in that one.
Yeah, yeah.
What Fred and Maceo do, just awesome.
And then also, the Brecker brothers are all up in there. And then also on Make My Funk, the P Funk, is also Joe Farrell, who was the sax player in Return to Forever, in the original iteration of Return to Forever. He played sax and flute, in that Flora Purim, Airto Moriera era of Return to Forever. So he actually shows up on Mothership Connection album as well, which is something a lot of people didn't know. And but it's that combination really of the Horny Horns and the Brecker brothers that makes such a slick, sophisticated, but round and bubbly horn section that really is showcased first on this album, and it continues to be showcased on stuff like Clones, all three of the Horny Horns albums, and funk and some of Funkadelic. That's awesome, so cool.
Clones. You mentioned clones. So.
Yeah, I'm a big Super 7 fan, so that's cool.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's definitely a sound. It's another one of those sounds that gets started in this year with this album. The big. There were already horns on P Funk Records before this, but there had never been sections like this, like the kind of stuff that Fred was arranging and the stuff Bernie was arranging, because Handcuffs is a ridiculous horn arrangement. That's Bernie, and even stuff like Tear the Roof Off, the biggest hit on the album, that was Bernie arranging, and then, in addition to having like a Bootsy side and a boogie side of these Parliament records, a lot of times it was one side would have more Fred horn arrangements and the other side would have more Bernie horn arrangements too. That would be another thing that it's definitely a George decision too. These were things he was because I know his style. And he's, we're gonna make one side that's all Fred, and one side that's all Bernie. You know, he does stuff like that. So sort of combining those elements and showcasing them as the yin and yang of Parliament. You know.
Mothership Connection was so amazing, Danny, that for me, it would, and a lot of like my favorite albums of all time are like this, I guess. But at any given time, one of the tracks would be my favorite.
Mm,
It's like they changed,
yeah.
because it was so strong throughout. It's like, oh, Unfunky UFO is my favorite. Oh, Mothership Connection, no, P Funk, or whatever. It's just
Hmm.
incredible masterpiece.
Yeah. Yeah. It really is, and it's one of those ones that still sounds like modern today. Like the other records have to be remastered, and or people feel like they need to be remastered or whatever. Uh, this is about as far away from Free Your Mind and Your Ass Will Follow as P Funk could get on a sonic level. And we talked about how they were flirting with kind of sonically cleaning up on those Funkadelic records, but nothing compares to how they shifted their sonic tonality on Mothership Connection. And George would say a lot of that is Jim Vitti too. Jim Vitti was a genius, absolute genius, and much in the way that, say, the Funk Brothers from Motown would try to do a different musical sound for every artist that they played behind, whether it was the Four Tops or Mary Wells or whoever. Jim Vitti would try to create a different sonic environment for not just every different band, but really for all the different albums. The sonic environment that you hear on, say, like, I don't know, Games, Dames, and Guitar Things by Eddie Hazel, as opposed to what you might hear on Funkadelic by Parliament, and they're around the same time, but it's how he decided to mic this and do. He was such a genius with that stuff, and it's definitely heard, on these records, that's for sure. But yeah, they were touching on some new ground, and as most people know, this would be the groundwork for a lot of what would come, not just from P Funk, but from hip hop decades later, and everything from the Make My Funk the P Funk to Mothership Connection, Swing Down Sweet Chariot. I mean, all this stuff finds its way into the G Funk lexicon in a big way. Let Me Ride becomes Dr. Dre's Grammy award winning song. It's basically not just an homage, but almost a cover of Mothership Connection, really. Um, they have a song that's just like Make My Funk the P Funk on that record. They've got music videos where the people are in the club and they're dancing to tear the roof off the sucker at the beginning of the video. I think it's the Snoop Dogg video for Doggy Dog World. And so you have these themes of Mothership Connection popping up all over the hip hop lexicon. And I was just using G Funk as a good example because you can like pinpoint some really important moments on The Chronic by Dr. Dre or Doggy Style by Snoop Dogg. But there is a samples list in the appendix of this book, and
Yes.
you can see just how much the songs from Mothership Connection get a big push in the sampling world and get like a rebirth in hip hop 2 decades later. But you also see how things like Get Off Your Ass and Jam, which you talked about earlier, was uber sampled in the period directly before that, mostly by East Coast hip hop. Public Enemies and your KRS Ones and EPMDs and Eric B. and Rakim and people like that were sampling the hell out of Get Off Your Ass and Jam. And it became a huge sample that went on to be sampled. The sample was sampled, and the sample was sampled over and over again. So it's a cool part of the appendix to be able to have the samples list. And again, it's not every sample P Funk ever did, but it's the samples from those 3 albums, at least the main ones, and even some interpolations too.
Yeah, I was going to mention that along with that great 10-page consolidated history. The samples thing is a very nice touch, Tad. Um,
Thank you.
were you talking about that comparison of the early primitive recording, to the very polished recording studio work? But also in the book, it's interesting that you make a comparison with the early rap of Funkadelic. And you say in the book, much like Mommy, What's a Funkadelic? George Clinton in P Funk talks about going to a part of the country and seeing how the funk was interpreted there.
Mm.
And I was like, wow, that's really interesting, going all the way back to that first record and looking at how that sort of translates into some of Mothership.
Yeah. Mothership is a rebirth. When I was a young Funkadelic fan listening to these records on my boombox as a kid, I noticed really early on that Mommy What's a Funkadelic and P-Funk, or as we call it in the band, Make My Funk the P-Funk. P-Funk wants to get funked up. They both do something that's exactly the same, but in a different light. George talks about, like you just said, he talks about the state of funk in different parts of the country and how it's perceived and how he needs to perceive it at that time for survival, for continuation on this, or like for whatever, for his striving to be funkier, and both songs do it in an interesting way that connects them. And P-Funk, wants to get funked up is sort of returning to this theme in a way where they're like, Mommy What's a Funkadelic began this entire Parla-Funkadelic thing post the Parliaments. Mothership Connection is the new Mommy What's a Funkadelic, or I should say, Make My Funk the P-Funk specifically, is the new Mommy What's a Funkadelic. It's a new album opener where it's George stream of consciousness kind of spoken word still, but so different. The music is different. The recording is different. The use of effects is way different. How they're pushing their funk is totally different. But the concept of I went to this place and this is what their funk was doing, that happens in both of those songs. But some time has passed, so the interpretation is completely different. The paradigm shift has already occurred to make the state of funk as we know it between 1969 and 1975 two very different looking things. So yeah,
And funk had progressed so much too
yes,
in what it was
definitely.
by then. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think that George always uses this terminology when he talks about the way Funkadelic played and also the way the meters played. He calls it that real basic funk. He always says that real basic funk. And I think that has to do with sort of the evolution of funk. And it can't be mis or underrepresented the fact that Mothership Connection really evolves the funk in a way it had never. It envelops jazz in a new kind of sophisticated way that, Earth, Wind and Fire's first records have some jazz, but they're doing it like college kids. And I'm not saying that in like a disrespectful way, but it's like college.
It's more linear,
Yeah. It's like that college jazz kids playing the solos and doing the stuff. This is like George saying, I want to put some kind of jazz sound up in there. And it's not just straight jazz. It's something people just haven't heard yet, but they can relate it. The ear can go back to like, oh, this has got like a jazzier thing. And even with like Mudbone's drum part, like people are relating that to some kind of like, but if you listen to the part, it's really very unorthodox. So it's like taking unorthodox things that have a familiarity and injecting them into an already existing funk archetype and turning it into something where it's like, wow, they really fused this and this. But what they actually did was took some stuff that didn't really fit in any bag and put them together and made you think of something else. So,
with uber talented players.
Yeah, with like the best of the best. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if you can see back here. Can you see that? So there's the Mothership Connection record I mentioned.
Yep, I can see it.
But up above it is the first Funkadelic record. It's right over Mothership Connection.
Oh, nice.
So that actually connects what you're just talking about.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, that was not intended.
Yeah. It's something that I wasn't going to even talk about in the book at first. And then I was like, well, that'd be a kind of cool callback to, because, and it's something that until I started writing about it, I hadn't really thought much about, except I did think about that concept of the two different his lyrics being related. But I hadn't really put the idea down as like the rebirth, and it really is though like the rebirth of that sound. And look, we were a Parlo-Funkadelic thing before. Now we have a new name for it with the rebirth of the sound. Now we're going to call it P-Funk.
It's like the Da Vinci Code. You're like putting these
Yeah,
things together and figuring it out and drawing the parallels and connecting the dots and all that stuff. I mean, it's
yeah,
so much fun. Just an example of how deep P-Funk is and all the different things you can get into when you start digging.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
Man, it's just incredible. Um, but to me, I felt like, yeah, Mothership Connection was like a quantum leap, you know, in not just P funk, but in funk and just music and just vibe and just the movement and just, like you were talking from the get go about it, taking on the whole Mothership thing. It just was all that and more. I mean, it just cannot be overstated.
You've got the progression of the Afrofuturist concept, taking it from the Sun Ra and sort of applying it into a popular music context, like in a way that it had never been done before. And then, George had never been shy to the Bible, but like the idea of combining biblical context with and sort of religious songs with this outer space incorporation to link to Sun Ra, this outer space incorporation um, was really brilliant. And it was a continuation of how Sun Ra would mix Egyptology with sci-fi. George was mixing the sort of black experience, the cultural, the black church in the deep south, and connecting that with spaceships, and so and even connecting it with tribalism, because you have your Gaga Gugas and all that kind of stuff with Night of the Thumpasaurus peoples, and um just the idea of symbolic transcendence and the transcendence of repetition, the transcendence of words, the transcendence of thoughts. And Mothership represents all of those things. And again, you can write treatise after treatise about the symbolic representation of the Mothership, the symbolic representation of P-Funk mythology. And again, through the sort of all-encompassing nature of George's characterizations, you have the innate birth of Starchild and Sir Lollipop Man. And while they're not the first characters to frequent Parliament-Funkadelic lore or songs, they're definitely more important than the ones that would come before. And in their importance, they would drive a new character-driven narrative home that would include Dr. Funkenstein, Sir Nose devoid of funk, Mr. Wiggles, Uncle Jam, Wellington Wigout, and on and on and on, in a world, like an ever-growing, like comic book world for and P-Funk starts representing that with Mothership Connection, because you've got Queen Freakaline, which is like an earlier character, but she's mostly born out of Pedro Bell's liner notes, and you've got a couple characters sort of, but they're usually born and die in one song.
Rumpa
They're
Steelskin. Yeah.
But that's later.
Yeah.
All of that is later. I'm talking about stuff before
Yeah.
Star Child, before Make My Funk to P Funk. You have, I'm trying to think of some other ones. George has one, the character I am the Magnificent was one character. The Funkadelic was a character first, but again, these characters were born and died in the songs that they appeared in. However, with the beginning of Mothership Connection, you have Sir Lollipop Man, Long Haired Sucker, you have Star Child. These characters grow out from the song instead of being an ingredient in the song. They
Mhm.
become bigger than the song. And so That's a new change as well. That's a new paradigm shift comparing to the older Funkadelic and Parliament records. That the characters become outcroppings, outgrowths that eclipse their songs in many ways and give rise to both more characters and the reoccurrence of their characters as well. So Starchild becomes one of many protagonists in this great battle because you have to have a good guy and a bad guy, and so then you start having a bunch of good guys and bad guys created in this, like I said, this comic book world, this sci-fi world, this fantasy world that gives P-Funk a brand new dimension and pushes it outside of just band and into phenomena, you know.
And they were already off in their own thing and their own,
Definitely.
and then just adding to it.
Yeah.
And just, Mothership Connection, just it's so thematically tied together well. And even just, in the opening track when George says to stay tuned for Star Child, y'all,
Yeah.
like it just flows, right? It's so awesome.
Right. And it helps that the personnel it's pretty much all the same personnel in those first two songs for the most part. You've got George and Gary and Bootsy and Bernie, and you got Fred and Maceo and the Brecker brothers and Glenn, and Mudbone. You've got like all the people, so they really just kind of float right into the next thing. Same drummer, same bassist, same keyboardist, same guitarist, same horns. It helps with the continuity. But there is a thematic continuity, that you don't really see as much before that. Again, like you mentioned, they do play with a lot of this stuff. There's already a mythology. There's already these these vast liner notes that Pedro Bell had created. There's already these costumes, this artwork, these crazy stage shows. But Mothership Connection pushes it into storyline in a much more transcendent way. Storyline becomes focused instead of a jarring sort of
or more
scary,
less random. Yeah.
And scary. Like before that, the stories were scary. I mean,
Yeah.
go to Cosmic Slop, any number of songs off that, and I'm not just talking about the title track. I'm listening to No Compute or Trash a Go-Go. They've got like scary, their themes are like kind of freaky and weird. And again, it's not going to work great for radio, but that's not why we loved those songs. However, Mothership Connection works for radio, and we still love those songs. Those of us who don't care about if it's a hit or not, but those of us who just love this music, it has the double staying power of being both palatable and still being that beloved P-Funk that we just eat up,
For sure. And Bernie takes everything to an nth degree on Mothership Connection. I mean,
yeah,
the organ stuff and the synth stuff and of course the piano stuff. But I mean, in particular on Super Groovalistic, on a Symphosaurus and P-Funk to some extent. Did you ever get a sense or ask George, like how much of that was really just Bernie bringing those sounds and experiments on his own? Or was George saying, that sound, I want that sound?
right. Well, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but Bernie definitely had specific settings that he would use that were his like primary settings to use live for specific songs. I'm pretty sure that they're born out of him getting this gear and playing with it and just trying things, because he was that kind of a player. At the same token, they always cut more songs than they needed, and they always cut more parts than they needed. So going again back to George's sort of production prowess, there were songs that didn't make it on Mothership Connection, and for whatever reason, but the reason was probably good because the album went platinum. And there were overdubs that didn't make it. And again, that was probably for the right reason. What you hear and when you hear it and where the space is and why it's there are all really important factors that go towards a person's sort of innate understanding and liking of an album that make it either a hit or not a hit, especially back in those days. So, it was a little bit of both, but definitely you have to understand, those overdubs that Bernie did on the Art Pro Soloist, there would be a rhythm track already. Sometimes there'd be drums, sometimes there wouldn't. There'd be a man in the box. And then Bernie would do those overdubs they would be later in the process, probably before the horns and the vocals, sometimes around the same time. And George may say Bernie would be like messing with different sounds, and George would be like, I like that one. Can you do something with that? They did stuff like that a lot, and then it would become an outcropping of something that Bernie would develop, and then he would slowly make a more evolved version of that over time. So sometimes it does come from the combination of the two of them, sort of. Most of the best production stuff that came out of Parliament-Funkadelic was like collaboration between things that Bernie was playing and ideas that George had. So this wasn't new for them. They had done this kind of stuff together, Clinton and Worrell, for a long, long time, even before Bootsy was there. So yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, and also just the new technology all of a sudden being available.
I think it's also interesting in the book how you point out with George adding, Mutron effects to like boogie, like after, the fact.
Yeah.
I never even thought about that.
Yeah, he does it later too on Wizard of Finance on the Funkadelic record too. That was that Mutron effect, and like the combination of like the already fuzz stuff that Bootsy had introduced in like Chocolate City, and then that more liquidy kind of envelope thing that he had put on Make My Funk the P-Funk. It just became such a big deal. And then with Bootsy's new record coming right behind it, it was another one of those sounds like the ARP that just changed everything. So yeah, George would take it and put it on other players as well. I mean, there's even a little bit of that on Maceo's saxophone on How the Name Is Bootsy Baby. He does a little sax solo at the end, and you can hear the effect on there. And it was probably put on later, after the fact, or put on plug the mic into it or something. But yeah, that was used to a really interesting effect in those like important Bootsy years.
Almost maybe I'm thinking like, deciding after the fact to maybe add a clap track to a particular tune or something like that.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. The without getting too much into it, the incorporation of the clap track was really born out of the fact that a lot of times they already had organic claps, and then sometimes they would incorporate Carl Butch Small's like hand clap machine, where it's like these two pieces of wood that are like attached to a hinge, and and that's that like that. So all of those, the first big one in the P-Funk canon to have that is Flashlight, but it's a combination of that thing and like 40 people hand clapping overdubbed twice, So it's a mix of the organic hand claps. You listen to something like Up for the Downstroke or I Got a Thing, You Got a Thing, Everybody's Got a Thing. Those older records, those are just the organic hand claps. And then, once we have a Flashlight, we have the incorporation of the hand clap machine with hand claps, but it's still a piece of wood. It's not like people think like clap track. It gives a much different idea to the average musical person, and the incorporation of what they would call clap tracks would not be incorporated until probably like the Lindrum era, much later, or at least by like 81. And even then they were doing more songs that were the combination of the clap machine and live hand claps. I know that's kind of a digression, but I just thought I'd throw it out there.
No, that's cool. That's cool stuff. And you reminded me of something when you mentioned about Lindrum. I just wanted to just mention, I had it here somewhere. I had never really thought about before, but some of the vocal stuff that was going on, like in Let's Take It to the Stage and some of those more, esoteric tracks, I think maybe Prince got some of his influence from that in terms of those kind of screams he would do that were so unorthodox.
Yeah, I would say that. I'm trying to think of some of the other, even some of the stuff Glenn does on Bigfoot and can contribute to like some of those screams he did on that are kind of contributing to some of Prince's, but definitely things like the stuff the Parliaments and George is doing on Be My Beach, some of that stuff for sure, and even just some of the like background sounds on Get Off Your Ass and Jam, like the group vocal, like there's like little ad libs and things here and there. I think a lot of that stuff influenced Prince.
Some of that twisty kind of screaming, just the unorthodox,
Yeah,
type of vocalizing that P Funk would do on some of those.
yeah, Better
Nobody
by the
else
Pound.
did.
Better by the
Yeah.
Pound is another good one like that, and just certain vocalization stylings and things that George and Gary did, especially I think, but Glenn too, because Glenn had some screams that were like way above the normal register. So like a lot of that stuff was, yeah, I think a lot of that stuff influenced Prince in a huge way.
So, moving out of Mothership Connection, I just got to also add that you have a fantastic consolidation of what took place after that, you know? So that's really well done too, the way it's all, very tightly woven together
Thank
and,
you.
sums up, the entire legacy really after
Yeah,
75.
yeah, that one had to be a bit longer than the first one because it's 50 more years instead of 20. So it's more than double what the preceding chapter, the pre 75 chapter had. So I knew I had to, but when I was writing this, again, having only a year compared to like the lifetime that I was able to write the first book and sort of compile it, I wanted to focus on things that people wanted, specifically fans wanted, and also do what I always try to do, which is make this for everybody. I think this is good for people who have no idea what P Funk is, and I think
Mhm.
it's good for people who have loved nothing but P Funk for the last 50 years. I think it's good for both. Um, but in that section, in the first book when it came out, I tried to read all reviews, even bad reviews, and I was happy to say I didn't have a lot of quote unquote bad reviews. But anything that people would say in critique, I thought I would try to remedy in some kind of way in the second book. In some kind of poetic way. So one person had said, I wish they had a samples list. So I made sure I did a 75 centric samples list on this one. Somebody had also said, I wish they had more of the charting information. So now, with this new book, very quietly, this book has all of the charting information for the entire P Funk canon. And it's funny because it was something that I knew if I had added it to the other book, the manuscript would still just be so long. And I was just trying to find things that I could cut that would make sense. It's not that it was an afterthought. It was actually something that had to be not added for sake of space and to keep it from being cut into two volumes, essentially. But they had said that. And so I made sure that the prior 20-year chapter and the 50-year after chapter, as well as the three chapters dealing with the three albums in question, contain every bit of charting information that you could want for the albums, for the singles, and across the pop, R&B, and dance charts, and even the UK charts, for all of the songs that are part of the main Parliament-Funkadelic canon. So all of that stuff is in there. Another person had also asked, who was mad that I didn't include lyrics in the first book, and again, if there were lyrics in that book, it would be 8 gazillion pages long. There would be no way that it could even be a book. But we did actually include the lyrics in the original transcript of this new book of Make My Funk the P Funk. Unfortunately, due to ongoing legal battles, we were not able to include the full lyrics, although they were initially not just a part of the book, but a huge part of the book. They took up a gigantic chapter, the lyrics. It was, like 80 pages, something. It was a huge, the book was much longer, obviously, with the lyrics included. It was either going to be a part of the appendix or it was its own chapter. I can't remember what the final decision was, but because of legal stuff, we had to unfortunately omit it. But hopefully someday with a future edition, we can re-add those lyrics again.
Let me ask you, 75 to 78 run for P Funk, those 4 years, has there ever been a more impressive run in popular music than what they did in those 4 years?
Yeah, on an opinion level, 8 billion%. And I would also argue, I would put in there Pleasure Principle, Funk or Walk, All the Woo in the World, Games Dame and Guitar Thangs, the first Horny Horns record, because they all come in that end of that 78 period as well. So like I would put all of those in there for that 75 to 78 as, yeah, as the most insanely prolific uh, uh,
4 years. Because
really like 3 and some change years. Yeah, that any group has ever done. Sure, I would agree with that. And in terms of number of influential albums in that period, because you can count, it's a whole bunch. It's even more in '76, and then it's a few in '77, and it's a ton in '78. I think it's like 6 or 8 in '78. '77, there's 3 or 4. '76, there's 4 or 5. '75, there's 3. So that's a lot of albums. You add all those up, that's a ton of very influential, very important, very artistically profound. Yes, definitely. I thought you actually meant like from like strict charting, and I'd say there's probably a bunch of. It's probably
yeah,
a yeah,
P
yeah.
Funk was never about charting.
Right, exactly, exactly.
Yeah, I mean they didn't even go on Soul Train for God's sake.
Right,
Uh,
right. But that was political. That
John
was because
Cornelius thing, right?
Don Cornelius did not like George Clinton.
Hmm.
So yeah, that was what that was.
I thought it was kind of intentional because they didn't want to be in the mainstream like that.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, I could be wrong. I could be completely wrong, but based on what I'd heard, the stories I'd heard from band members and such, he was kind of didn't respect the P Funk, didn't care for it, was not a fan of it, and
Wasn't Frankie Crocker kind of anti-funk too?
I don't know. I never heard that. What did you know? What do you know about that? Where have you
I've
heard it?
heard from a number of interviews I've done with like funk, acts from back then, not necessarily P-funk per
Yeah,
se, but funk in general, that he was
really
not really, that guy, and he would, strong arm some of that, as in terms of getting the airplay and getting exposure. So
interesting. Huh.
I think
Wow.
there was a lot of, I mean, when you go back then, there was a lot of, there's a certain part of the African American culture back then that kind of looked down their nose at it like it was, maybe beneath or vulgar or, like funk used to be a bad word. The whole thing came
Yeah.
from that, but about it, not being uh, sophisticated enough or where they wanted to kind of go or something, things like that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I would say that there was definitely a lot of that going on, at least from certain segments of society. I'd say that was true. I just didn't know that about Frankie Crocker. Yeah, I had no idea.
So when you have guys in positions of power like that in certain parts of the music industry, like I said, it didn't matter. George, I mean, those guys, no matter what, they weren't going to be stopped.
Yeah, they still found a way to like permeate and penetrate the less penetrated areas of music and find their way into places where they had never been before Mothership. That's for sure. Mothership gave them almost like a direct access to more living rooms and more record stores and more radio play and all that stuff, despite the comments that you made, the apropos comments that you made about that, because I'm sure, yeah, it's very true, and a lot of times too. And then later, it got lumped in with disco and all kinds of crazy stuff. So yeah, there was definitely a few different layers of society, both within and outside of the Black community, that looked down on funk for sure.
So how many times did you go back and listen to those three albums to do this book? Like, were you just nonstop, like for weeks or something, just playing those?
It's funny. I didn't listen to them as much as you would think in the writing process. I would go to them when I needed some inspiration, like, oh yeah, what else can I say about this or something like that. But I wasn't all of that was like from my love of it. Like everything that I wrote was, sort of streaming in my mind from just the love and my historical memory of these songs and albums, and then bracketing them with the primary source interviews, and then bracketing them with, again, this being the first real P-Funk monograph, everything is sourced, everything has footnotes, everything that wasn't taken from an interview is footnoted and end noted and sourced in the back of the book. So if I make a statement, it has to be backed up. So That's more the mode I was in,
Is
you
that
know.
is that is that the publisher that, or is that the nerd that Danny is with history stuff?
They had, well, it's both. They wanted, if this was going to be a history book, we had to do it in what they call the Chicago style. That's the style I learned how to write how to write in when I was doing my history major and the colloquial and all that stuff. So that's, it's required. But they also were adamant about making sure I did footnotes and endnotes. I did chapter notes. I did a works cited. Um, yeah, we went bibliographically. We went in pretty deep, and I have to say, nothing that I wrote. I don't have any kind of ghostwriter. My editors don't even contribute in the way that people would probably think. They just, all my editors do are like, yeah, we like it, Danny, like it's good, or they'll say like, oh, you spelled this word wrong, or something like that. um I have no help. Even the everything that went into this, I did myself, so including the end notes and the footnotes, which, some people would be surprised maybe to hear. But, and that's something you got to go back with a fine-tooth comb when it comes to
That's the
those.
grunt work right there.
That stuff is crazy. I have to go back and like, what book did I read that in? Where did I read that? And I'm like going through like history books trying to find like, it might be like a demographic population census book, and I have to find like the page and the quote. Like, where did I find this? Yeah, so
Gotta be meticulous. Yeah.
it has to be meticulous to make it happen. So it's a combination of the publisher and myself, really.
What do you hope that readers take away from the book, Danny?
Well, I hope that they can get a better understanding that this is a developing historiography. I hope that they can get an understanding that there is a historiographical body of work that is being in the process of being developed, and that they can be on the ground level for the sort of academicization, the proper academicization of P-Funk in its authentic form. Before everybody's gone and dies, we need to have these represented, representable, primary source backed historiographical works that represent both an important time in the history of the canon, but also represent a time capsule, and it represent a carrying on of the tradition, so that future generations can know this, have this knowledge, and pass this knowledge on. It's really about the knowledge and the wherewithal in the transmission of history, more so than just the history itself. So, you know, what we're doing right now, I think, is very important in terms of carrying this information on into future generations, because with the accession of things like AI and all this stuff, I'm not an AI user, and MIT did a study on AI where they said, it takes away your creative brain and you stop retaining. And so all that stuff scared me away from you. So I don't use it. But the interesting thing at the end of the MIT study was that people who don't use AI are making AI better, and people who do use it let AI make them worse. Essentially, is what the case study had ended with. And in doing so, with that first statement, the former statement, the more important aspect of that is that AI is a way that most people are getting information these days, at least, just getting regular information. And with the accessibility of AI to literary works, to historiographical works, including my books, I'm carrying on the tradition of passing this not just over to people, but over to the devices that give information to people. So we're trying to create this historiographical contextual body in as soon as possible, in a way, so that it can be transmitted into this new communication device, or whatever you want to call it. I am, in fact, in not using it, making it better. So my books are actually making AI more more accurate, and whether I like it or not, it's just the truth to the matter. So what I want people to understand is there is a vast historiographical body of understanding that has not been picked up by AI yet, and that AI is, if you like, the other day I was trying to remember who um who wrote this P-Funk glossary that was in the back of the liner notes on one of these Parliament compilations, and it was
Yeah.
like a really cool glossary. I was like, who was it that wrote? Was that Tom Vickers or what? So I ask Siri or whatever on the stupid thing in my kitchen, right? I say, hey Siri, I was washing the dishes. Who wrote that glossary in the Parliament? And so Siri tells me that Gary Dr. No Scheider wrote that. Gary Dr. No Scheider. Now, of course, for those people who know, there is no Gary Dr. No Scheider. There are two different people. There's Gary, there's Dr. No, you know, and then there's Gary Scheider. They're two totally different people. Neither one of them wrote the glossary on the liner notes,
Yeah.
but for whatever reason, it
It's scary
shows
when you think about
it
the,
is stupid.
yeah.
So my purpose is not only righting wrongs, human wrongs, but righting the wrongs of the machines that people are going to be getting all their information from 20, 30 years from now,
AI
or
is
or
only as good
sooner.
as what's fed into it. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's sort of what I want people to take from them, that this is just the beginning of a much larger, broader historiographical adventure into the world of the P-Funk that will be growing with time. With every new memoir, Seth Neblett has a great book.
I was going
Don
to mention.
Don Silva has a great book. George has a great memoir, a great autobiography. Fred Wesley has a great autobiography. These new like P-Funk centric memoirs are definitely helping the process and building up a larger bibliographical set of works for people to study P-Funk from and understand it better. And I'm just trying to do my part as well. Since I'm trained as an historian, I can really gravitate towards that one sort of aspect that we don't have in representation in our P-Funk bibliography, and that's history books. So I'm creating the curriculum for what could be a P-Funk class in any college, or something that nobody's even thought of yet. I'm trying to help create the curriculum on a bibliographical level.
You just made me think of, I think it was Bootsy put out an album called P University or,
Right.
yeah.
Yep. Yep. Fresh out of P University.
Yeah, maybe he could be the dean of that school.
Right. Nice.
Yeah. That's awesome. And I was going to mention Seth's book because it came out relatively close to your book. And
Yeah.
I was a little concerned that, there might be some repetition or something like that, but there's not. I think they complement each other really well because
That's
his
great.
book is, personal accounts and memories and perspectives of, the experience. And yours is all about, the records and the impact of those. I think they go together really well.
I love to hear that. Yeah. I had, when it first saw that the release dates were similar, I was like, I wonder how that's going to go. But they not only both like found themselves on either side of each other on the Amazon charts, they also like created an impetus for a return of George's autobiography to the charts, a return of Fred's autobiography to the charts, a return of Ricky Vincent's funk history book to the charts. Because the people who were buying our books, well, who are buying his book or buying my book, they're buying my book, they're buying his book, but they're also picking up these other things, and so increasing the knowledge, the general knowledge about P-Funk history across the board, which is what I like about it. And I know that the people, there will be so many more memoirs coming out in the coming years. You never know which band members are going to have their memoirs come out in the, let's just say, the next 20 years. I've talked to a lot of people that have plans and that are trying to do things and that will probably do things that we haven't even thought about yet. I'm trying to make it my place to write the type of books that nobody else in our world can do, so that I'm doing the best version of my part that I can do. So, maybe someday I'll write a memoir too, but I care much more about the sort of historical side and pushing the historical narrative into the minds of new music listeners, of longtime P-Funk fans, of music students who need to learn more about P-Funk's place in American music history, and all of those aspects. All the books help that in a way, in an important way. But I know that these history monographs, this is going to be, this is, it's for everybody, but it has an academic approach that's so important to this thing being fielded towards the universities in the coming decades.
And my hope too is by association of that, that it just also promotes the entire genre of funk to a higher awareness. Um, as we were talking, you're talking, I was just thinking, it's like I envy anybody who maybe is young or whatever and would be brand new to this, and maybe they discover through looking at your book or they hear one of the records and they see your book. And can you imagine at this stage of your life or at this time of existence, if you were again brand new to the music and the information and the whole movement? You know, I mean, gosh, it's so awesome.
I know it is. It's so cool to see different ways that people got into this thing that's so important to you and I, because we have our collective singular memories and visions of what it was that allowed us to understand about this music and to discover new parts of this music, new corners of this music, and yeah, my hope is that with the I have to say that there is a good percentage of the buying demographic that represents what you were just saying, the aforementioned, the people that are just finding out about it, and this book is representing something to them. I mean, that's amazing for me. That's like a dream come true, that I'm able to sort of spread. And like you said before, that the idea of funk as a genre in its own right, getting more, all of these books do that really well, including the great books that Dwayne Tudall wrote about Prince. All of these things really help accelerate what should have already been accelerated, a long time ago. It's right. It's about righting wrongs that were made in the past, essentially.
Oh yeah, for sure. What what do you think's new for P Funk itself? I mean, I know George has put it out, some songs from the past through the Patreon, stuff like that. But do you have a sense? Is there going to be more albums? Is there going to be, more aside from your own, which are always happening? But I mean, from the real, P Funk, whether it's
Yeah.
Parliament-Funkadelic, George.
If you ask him, he'll say yes. And in speaking of the Patreon, something that he's just started to do is, I know he added one last month. He's starting to slowly release a new album on Patreon. I think he's done 2 songs so far. And I don't know if this is like, it could be the new P Funk All Stars album. With George, it's one of those things, I've said it before. You never know like who it's going to be on until it comes out, kind of. But he's already released 2 to the patrons that are brand. This isn't unreleased stuff. This isn't in the archive. This isn't old tracks. This is new songs for a new album that he has coming out. And his plan is he wants to release it on Patreon first. So, he's always been about, new technology and new ways. And I was the one who told him, look, you'll make more money digitally on Patreon than you will on all your digital stuff combined, because Patreon is for the artist. It goes directly to the artist. It's not some fraction of a penny that you're getting after the fact. You're getting exactly how much you ask for. And he likes that concept. Who wouldn't? What creative wouldn't like that concept? So yeah, the new album is being leaked slowly. And actually, not even that slow. Like I said, it's been a couple tracks already in just a few months. He'll probably leak the whole album that way. It's just me speaking. It's just conjecture, but I think that's what he's planning on doing. That's sort of what he had told me. And that's just one of many, because without saying too much, I think there's 3 finished albums in the can right now that are like awaiting release. And unfortunately for the viewers, I don't have any insight as to how, where, when, or what he will release either first or because there's three. It's like I said, it's three full albums. I think one is going to be a George Clinton album. I think one is a P Funk All Stars album. Not really sure exactly what the other one is, but they're all new George Clinton, Parliament-Funkadelic, P Funk All Stars stuff, and I just never know what order he's going to release it in or when. That's all kind of more in the Sea Conspiracy, the record label. Those guys, they run that side of it, and I unfortunately have no real insight for the fans. Although, as the person who runs his Patreon for him, I can tell you that that's probably the most commonly asked question right now is, will there be another album? Can we get some more albums? Can you please tell him to put out some new stuff? And, I get it all the time. Like, I don't really have a good answer for it, though. You know what I mean? Like, this stuff, a lot of time, if it's on a label, there's everything that goes with that. If it's DIY, there's everything that goes with that. They have a process that I know that they have to do. But yeah, no, I don't have any like great insight into it.
I think it's 7 years now since Fraud Dog, and I
Yeah.
remember there was supposed to be sort of like a sister album with that,
Yes.
which was P Funk All Stars, I think. And
Yes.
yeah,
And so, I mean, and then I mean, when I say three albums, it could even be five albums because there's another couple projects I was just thinking of that he's also working on. And it's all like P Funk. It's not like somebody's solo album or like a side project. They're all the stuff he's working on right now is either like his solo thing or P Funk All Stars or some other iteration of the core. Uh, but again, when I I have no idea. I
yeah.
wish I knew more. I wish I could say like I have the inside scoop to win this thing. I have no idea. I have no clue.
Well, I'm thinking that with things like your books, hopefully it will stimulate, assuming that the legalities are straight and stuff like that, some re-releasing of some of the past works, and remastering and deluxe versions and box sets, and things like that. That the catalog has not gotten. Give the catalog attention like a Deep Purple, a Led Zeppelin, a Pink Floyd. I mean, it deserves that.
I will say that is in the works because George recently said to me about all that, but without saying too much because I don't know all the specifics until, like you had briefly said, until all the legality stuff is straightened out. There probably won't be any reissues from within the organization until they've finished some of this, some of the long, grueling legal process that I can only begin to understand a percentage of. Unfortunately, that plagues the process for sure.
I was thinking about as far as the books go, and you mentioned you're doing others. I had it on my notes here about that, but I think even something like, covering George Clinton's capital output, years and things like that. I mean, there's so many different angles you could take on this.
Yeah, I already have like my first 5 years picked out, and they're all ones that, without giving it away, they're all ones that people would want to have a book about. And so, coming to the one you said, there's definitely one from that period that we're talking about. There's some other really important periods too, and then even some earlier period stuff that I also want to do. So yeah, there's going to be more books of this type, I'm happy to say.
We'll bring them on. And all right. So I think we've spent enough time geeking out on this, but I want you to fill us in on what you have coming up next. We'll try to get this in front of folks next week. So talk about maybe early November onward. What's your plans relate to the book and also other musical things you have going on?
Sure. So starting at the really, November, December, we're doing a number of book shows, book fairs. We're doing the One Word, One Book New Orleans Festival in New Orleans on November 22nd. I'm doing a talk there with Melissa Weber and Seth Neblett. And there's also going to be a poetry reading earlier that day by my wife, Batavian Lewis. So that's going to be a fun thing. And then the first week of December, Secret Army is going out and doing a further book tour up in the Northeast. We are playing in Teaneck, New Jersey, and New York City. We're playing in Maynard, Mass, and in Searsport, Maine. So we're just kind of going up the East Coast. That's December 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th, or 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th. I'm sorry. And you can find those dates on everywhere on my social media and stuff, or And in the new year, we have a bunch of really cool events coming up. We're going to be doing at least 2 festivals in Tallahassee in promotion of the book. George is doing one of them with us, the Word of South Festival on April 25th. And we're going to do a brand new curated set of never before heard stuff or rarely heard stuff from the book and from the period in question. These shows, we've done a few already in the past weeks, and they've been really successful. We're doing more stuff like that in April, May, June, and kind of going through the next year. Lots of book fairs, some more university appearances, and so yeah, more stuff will be coming as the year goes on.
Wow, a lot of stuff. And are you keeping a website with that, or just social media stuff?
It's all still social media plus like Eventbrite and stuff like that. But like people can find me on Facebook. I have Danny Bedrosian, and there's also Daniel P. Bedrosian, and there's also my band Danny Bedrosian and Secret Army. That's all on Facebook. You can find all the dates and all the news there. And then I have an Instagram. It's just under my name, Danny Bedrosian, and then you can also really one of the best places to find out about all my upcoming shows and get the actual specifics is my YouTube show, Danny on Everything, which a lot of times serves as like a promotional tool for me. I also do a lot of interviews and concerts and discussions and other stuff too. But there's always a little section of the show where I detail all the upcoming concerts and things. And so that YouTube channel is just Danny on Everything. You can find it on YouTube. It's real easy. And so, yeah. And then, of course, I just always want to recommend that people, you please recommend it for the book, Make My Funk the P-Funk, for your local brick and mortar bookstores, because they already carry it on their like backlog or whatever, Barnes and Noble, Books A Million, they all have it. So if you recommend it, they'll stock it. And also for your local public library, if you're in college, for your local university bookstore or university library, or even if you're in high school, for your local school library. The first book has found its way into a lot of libraries, a lot of public libraries, a lot of university bookstores. And I'm happy to say that the second book is already continuing that trend. So we just want to have that happen as much as possible. So please recommend it for your local brick and mortars.
And are you doing any signed copies by mail, or only in the
Yes.
personal appearances?
So I do like an inscribed author's editions that you can get for $50 from me through my Cash App, Venmo. The Cash App is $Danny Bedrosian, and the Venmo is @Daniel Bedrosian. And they can get it's like a personal inscribed and signed and personalized edition of the book, plus a free gift. So everybody can get it directly from me as well now.
When I saw you play in Charlotte, that small keyboard, what keyboard is that?
So that's a Novation Base Station 2, and it is a synthesizer I've been using since 2013, 2014. It is the synth I use on Flashlight these days when we play Flashlight, but it's also like my go-to lead synth for my solos and stuff. And all the patches that you hear me play on it are patches I created. So I don't do any presets. It's all made patches. A lot of times keyboard players, they see me after the show. They're like, I got to get one. I'm like, yeah, they're great. And then they hit me up later. They're like, dude, what? It doesn't have any of the stuff that you played. I'm like, oh, I made those sounds, So, you can make sounds on them, and it's very user friendly for that. It's probably my favorite modern synthesizer, and my favorite like solo synth. It's great to carry. You can lift it over your head. You can do all kinds of crazy stuff with it. So I usually bring that with me almost everywhere I go.
All you need is for it to be wireless. Then you'd really be out of
I
control.
know. Tell me about it. Yeah, that'd be the move right there. But I got like 8 of them, and they're all full of different sounds, and I break out different ones. And in fact, the stuff I did on the Trolls World Tour, the synthesizers I did on that are mostly the Novation Bass Station 2, including sounds that I had made specifically just for the movie.
Hmm. You ever do guitar?
Yeah, I used to have a Roland Axe, which is like one of those. It's like it doesn't have any sounds of its own, but you can like run it MIDI into like a Moog or into something else. And I did it, for one little period. But it was during like the kind of dark days of MIDI with the MIDI locks and all that kind of stuff. So I would like to like go back and pick one up again with the new technology, because now there's way more opportunities with that type of an instrument than there was 15 years ago.
Hmm. All right. Yeah. I was worried for your well-being a little bit with some of the maneuvering you would do with that keyboard around the stage and all the wires and cables. And
Yeah, there's always, I know it's always a thing. Yeah, every time it's a little different. We'll see what it's gonna do. It's always kind of like a fun adventure. It's part of the show.
yeah, it's like going back to George's days of just, whatever it calls for, whatever, just put it on the sheet, nothing underneath
Exactly.
and just let it all hang
Exactly.
out.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yep. Raw.
Awesome. Hey, Danny, man, so much fun. Thank you so much. Best of luck on the book, continued success. And, thanks for, again, carrying that torch and keeping the P-Funk alive and funk alive in general.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for your continuation of a beautiful use of the medium, and thank you for your invaluable interviews. This is another kind of thing that people will have forever and ever to source, their information about history of the funk. So keep doing the incredible historical work you're doing, sir.
I couldn't stop if I wanted to.
Right.
All right, man. Well, be well.
Okay. Thank you, Scott.